Welcome. You've clicked yourself into Three Guys and an iPad, the only mortgage-focused podcast still awaiting certification by the Wayne County Board of Canvassers. I'm Brian Rieger. I'm the co-founder of Content Beacon and one of the three guys behind this project. I'm joined as always by my friend and the co-founder of Content Beacon, Rick Grant. Mr. Grant, how are you today?
Doing great, Brian. Good to see you as always. Man, I've been looking forward to this show. You've put something together really special. Can't wait to get into it.
This is a team effort, and unlike most times, you aren't going to be hearing much from me today. I am, of course, obligated to introduce my other friend, Kevin Breeland from Amplify Credit Union. He is really the first of the three guys. Kevin, how are things in Austin today?
Well, thank you for introducing me, Brian. They are sunny, beautiful, and warm as always.
I would expect nothing less today. Glad to have you, Kevin. All right, this is the part of the show where very quickly I remind you that we're produced by Content Beacon, the industry's only B2B content marketing agency. If you'd like to learn more about us, if you'd like to be on our podcast, or you'd like to see someone, or you'd like to berate us for what we've done already, you see the emails in the show notes, brian@contentbeacon.com, rick@contentbeacon.com. And with that, we're going to get to why we're here today. I am surrounded here today virtually by a lot of bright people, but we are here in primary part to discuss Phil Schulman, our special guest. Phil is a partner in Mayor Brown's Washington, D.C. office, and he's really one of the preeminent attorneys in the financial services and mortgage industry. He was nationally ranked by Chambers USA from 2012 to 2014 under Financial Services Regulation, Consumer Finance. He's a member of the esteemed American College of Financial Services Lawyers, and he is the former general counsel to the Home Improvement Lenders Association and the former assistant general counsel of the Inspector General and Administrative Proceedings Division. He is also, and that of course is within U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. He's ranked by the Legal Network as one of the top lawyers in Washington, D.C., as has been in his past, and he is peer rated in the Martindale-Hubbell directory as AV Preeminent, the very highest level of professional excellence. Phil, I didn't even know that existed. That's amazing. I'm being serious here. Finally, Phil's authored dozens of articles on issues affecting the settlement services industry. He's a frequent contributor to a number, if not all, of the major mortgage publications. And he is the co-author with Lawrence Platt of A Practical Guide to the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, which was published by Warren Gorman Lamont. But I think most of you watching today, there you go, Mr. Levy. I think most of you watching today are going to recognize Phil from the stage somewhere. He's quite possibly the very best speaker for the mortgage and financial services industry and has been for a number of years. He's quite possibly the funniest attorney you'll ever meet. With that introduction, Mr. Schulman, thank you for joining us today.
Wow, I think I should quit there, really. This can only go downhill from here, but thank you for that beautiful introduction. Just the way.
It's my pleasure, and it's the least I can do. But I'm not going to be the only one chatting with you today, Phil. Today it's more like 14 guys and one lady. We've got a lot of old friends, and everyone here could be a special guest of their own. I'm going to introduce them briefly for you. You'll probably recognize all of our guests. Our first is Chuck Cain, Senior Vice President at Fidelity National Financial from Cincinnati today. A frequent flyer on the show. Chuck, welcome.
Thank you very much, Brian. And I just want to say it's an honor and privilege to be here. Not so much for me, but certainly for Phil. And that also, too, to add to Phil's bio, and I just saw this coming across from ESPN, that Scott Layden, the general manager of the Timberwolves, said that he would never have taken Anthony Edwards if he knew Phil was going to be available after the first of the year.
With that, I'd like to introduce our next special guest. This is Joe Drum, Senior Vice President of National Agency at Fidelity National Financial. And I believe, Joe, you're coming to us for Santa Barbara today?
I am. That's correct. And thank you, Brian. Excuse me. And thank you very much for inviting me to this. I, too, wouldn't miss this for the world. Phil, I'm very honored to be here. And I guess, Brian, one caveat is calling Phil the funny, well, one of the funniest attorneys is like saying he's the tallest midget in the room. And that's just the first of things that are going to have to be edited today. But what can you say about Phil Schulman that hasn't already been said about Jeffrey Epstein? So,
Well,
I'm sorry. I do. Well, I love the guy, and with that, I'm going to let it go because I don't know anyone better in his field, and I don't know a better person. Thank you.
And Joe, we'll be coming back to you. We're going to hear from all of our guests today. We'll keep the train rolling. And by the way, Joe, Phil pays me by the word, so I'm just using them all up if I can. So our next guest is also a friend of the show. You've seen him many times. Brian Levy, who is of counsel at Catton and Temple. And Brian, you're in Milwaukee today, I presume?
I'm in the suburbs of Milwaukee. Yes, I am. And it's actually a beautiful day here in Wisconsin, believe it or not, still in November. I, too, am incredibly honored to be here and to be able to say nice things about Phil Schulman. When Joe was talking, I thought he was going to say something about Jeffrey Toobin, so I wanted to make sure that we all knew that Phil is wearing pants today. So let's be thankful for that.
Well,
I
Brian,
will get the last word, though. You recognize that. But keep
Phil,
going, guys.
This is some of your last chances to speak for everybody else. Phil is definitely going to get the last word today. I'm going to continue on here. We're joined also another special guest, another friend of the show and frequent flyer. That's Trip Riley, a partner at Saul Ewing, Arnstein and Lair. And Trip, you're in Princeton today, correct?
Yes, beautiful Princeton. I too am honored to be here to honor Phil, and I'm glad to see that he's reverted to the 1970 haircut and mustache style because we know we're all going back there very soon. So I look forward to the show.
Well, thank you for joining us, Trip. And I'm pleased to introduce as well another friend of the show, Loretta Salzano, who is a partner with Franzen Salzano in Peachtree Corners, Georgia. Is that where we are today, Loretta?
I'm sitting in my home in Atlanta right now, and I'm so excited to be feeling good to honor my pal and my crush with or without his pants on, my friend Phil.
I think we are going to excerpt that as the promo for this show, Loretta. Thank you. We'll move on from there. We have another friend of the show and another esteemed attorney here today. You'll recognize him by his billable hours to the show. Marx Sterbcow, managing attorney from the Sterbcow Law Group in New Orleans. Marx, welcome back.
Thank you. Your check cleared again, so I do appreciate that. It was extra this week for Phil. But I would like to thank Phil. I'm honored to be on here, and Phil is my mentor. He taught me how to use the Zoom with the fist and the Zoom camera, and when he speaks up. Those were two great techniques that I've learned over the last year from Phil.
Oh, Phil's going to need an hour after this with all you guys. And Marx, if our check did clear, then someone's getting fired at our end. So we'll have to arrange for that. Our next guest could have a show of his own as well. Our honored next guest is Ken Trappetta. He is president and executive director of the Real Estate Services Providers Council, known as RESPRO. Ken, I assume we're welcoming you from Washington, D.C. today?
Actually at my home in Maryland, but close enough. I'm really glad to be here. Phil has taught me how to tell jokes. He's taught me everything about RESPA. I do have a question, though. So what happened in 2014 that you got off that Chambers list or something? I'm looking at your bio here. I don't know. You'll have to tell us at some point.
I didn't want to correct Brian, but I've been on that Chambers list from 2012 to the present. But it's okay.
Oh, sorry about that. My apologies, Phil. We're going to move along here. Our next special guest is the Senior Vice President of Agency Development at Old Republic Title. He's coming to us from the suburbs in northeastern Ohio today as well. Welcome, John Vaso.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'm honored to be here. I'm looking around. I think this should be called 12 Attorneys and a Sales Guy. At least I think that's it. Everybody's got a lot of credentials. I'm just a guy that we hired Phil once and we developed a relationship. and we get together. We have lunches, dinners, get off site at some of these places. I was lucky enough to have dinner with the funniest man in the business one night with his wife and my 2 daughters and my 14-year-old, who's now 26. After Phil exhausted many stories, some not so children friendly, he looked at us and goes, "Dad, I thought you said this guy was funny." And he told me to never bring her around again.
That's a true story.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for being here, John. And I have one more special guest that I'd like to introduce, and that is Joe Ventrone. He's Vice President, Federal Policy and Industry Relations with the National Association of Realtors. Joe, are you coming to us from D.C. today or somewhere else?
Yes, I am, and you can see the background in back of me. It's a pleasure to be here with all you lawyers. Hopefully, John V., you're not a lawyer, so we are in the distinguished class of not being a lawyer. My background, my affinity to Phil is actually a 5-letter word called RESPA. I used to use a 4-letter word when I was on the Hill, but my affinity to Phil is I started HUD in '74 when the HUD 1 was created. Then I went to the Hill in 1983 and met him under the controlled business arrangement. And ever since then, it's been downhill. But truthfully, I hope I can stay on to really roast him and say some bad things. Phil, I've been with the Realtors 19 years. I hired Ken Tripetta, and Ken left us and is heading up Respro. But I'm following Phil, and I'll be retiring the end of December, and I will enjoy cutting coupons with him, going to Costco, and maybe writing some dirty jokes. But seriously, I do want to say one thing. You look great. Are you using the same Botox that Hillary Clinton did during the campaign?
And with that, I probably can't hold him back any longer. Mr. Schulman, you have 30 seconds to rebut.
It's a delight to be here, really, and to be with my friends. I'll have an opportunity throughout this podcast to share with you some stories, probably involving most of you. So I'm going to hold my powder dry, as they say, and we'll get on to the serious part of the show first, and then I can't wait to jump in. All right, well, I'll kick things off. We can be serious for a moment. In no particular order, and these are my predictions, but I've also talked to some of my partners in Mayor Brown and done some reading. So I would say, first of all, we know the housing market is going to remain strong. We have low supply, great demand. It's a good time to be a home builder or a real estate broker, and that's going to continue into 2021 for sure. We have low interest rates, so I'm expecting we'll continue to have all kinds of consumer loans. Hard to believe that anybody in America has not refinanced already, but if they haven't, I suspect they will in 2021. We'll see more consumer loans as well, including car loans. I was at a car showroom a few weeks ago, and I couldn't believe the number of people buying cars. So consumer loans will be strong in 2021. As far as banking and mortgage banking, I think it's fair to say that economic inequality and consumer protection will be the bywords for this new administration. We'll see a rollback of a number of the Trump executive orders. I think we'll see stronger oversight of financial firms and greater public sector involvement in providing financial services. There's some talk about a postal banking. We've seen how the post office workers go postal when they're just talking about stamps. So I can't imagine what's going to happen if they actually have dollars in their building. But nevertheless, one other thing is the CFPB is toying with, and we've heard discussions about a federal credit reporting agency. And that may come to fruition in 2021, but I think it would probably need legislation. And we'll talk about the fact that there probably won't be a lot of new legislation given the Senate remaining in Republican hands, most likely. Predictions. Well, we know that Jerome Powell will be at the Fed till 2022, so that's not changing. We know that McWilliams will be at the FDIC till 2023, but we will get a new CFPB director based on the Selah Law case before the Supreme Court. The president can, at will, remove the executive director, so I think there's no question that Kathy Kreninger will be out. Somebody looking more like Richard Caudray than Mick Mulvaney will be the new director. I've heard a couple of names bandied about. Somebody named Chris Peterson, who ran for governor as a Democrat in Utah. Surprise, he didn't make it. And a woman named Katie Porter, who's an up-and-coming congresswoman who people think would be ideal for that spot, although I've also heard her name in the hat for Kamala Harris's Senate seat. So we'll have to see. And I heard that Leandra English, who was the director of the CFPB for about 15 minutes, is on the transition team. So who knows, maybe she'll pull a Dick Cheney and nominate herself for that position. I don't know. I think enforcement will be back with a vengeance, certainly in the fair lending space. You know that the CFPB moved fair lending out of a division spot and put it under supervision. There really was very little fair lending enforcement there in the last 4 years. Discrimination in lending practices, very little action by the Department of Justice the last 4 years. That's certainly going to increase as well. I think there'll be enforcement in the mortgage servicing space. It's usually confined to origination, but servicing is getting a lot more attention with all the forbearance and what's going on with people having difficulty making their mortgage payments. So I think we'll see enforcement in the mortgage servicing area. Certainly going to see a lot of lawsuits and enforcement by the government in connection with those PPP loans that were misappropriated and misused. Cybersecurity was the buzzword for the last year or two, but I think the new buzzword is going to be AI, artificial intelligence. And I think we'll start to see the use, perhaps, of artificial intelligence to underwrite loans. And that's going to require all kinds of regulation. And that may be a big deal in 2021. We need a stimulus package. We know that the moratorium on mortgage payments runs out at the end of the year. Renter moratoriums run out at the end of the year, and people desperately need help. But whether or not McConnell can get together with Pelosi and they can knock something out before the new Congress comes in, we'll have to see. On the title side, cybersecurity was a big deal for the title industry. And how did they solve it? The way they always do. They went back to the 18th century. And now it's kind of amusing to me that the way that we counter all of the cybersecurity, hacking, and fraud is we use telephones again. And we call whenever we're going to wire money to a different source rather than use emails and digital. So I think they've done a good job with that. Ron, the remote online notarization, kudos to the industry there, because at the beginning of the year, I think there were only a handful of states that had passed that legislation. As a result of the pandemic, there are 27 states that now recognize remote online notarization, and clearly that is going to jump in 2021. Final thoughts. Number one, despite what Mark Sterbcow thinks, the new president of the United States will be Joe Biden. It's going to happen, Mark. Get yourself used to it. He's still out there. I saw him yesterday trashing ballots in Louisiana, but it's over. Over, Mark. So the presidency will be Joe Biden, but because the House is hanging on Democratic-wise to a slim margin, and most likely they're not going to pick up 2 seats in Georgia, we are going to see more of an Obama-like administration from Biden, where he is fighting with and having difficulty with the Senate in getting his legislation through, which means an emphasis on on regulations and executive orders. So we'll see a lot of what we saw during the Obama administration, I think. And my last word, RESPA enforcement. I think the CFPB was on vacation the last 4 years, other than that Townstone case. And when the cat's away, the mice will play. I think that if the CFPB starts to look under the hood, we may see increased RESP enforcement in 2021. So those are my thoughts. I'm sure the panel has many more, so I'll turn it back to you, Brian.
Yeah, there's a lot of food for thought there, Phil, and you're calling for quite a change on the enforcement front. I'm going to open it up to our panel at this point. There's a lot to discuss. If you want to throw a comment out there, what's the Biden administration look like, or what do you think about some of the things that Phil has tossed out there?
Yeah, this is Joe. I want to just interject. I agree with everything Phil said, except for Katie Porter for the head of the CFPB. Katie Porter is a great member, and from I'm speaking from NAR's standpoint, we've supported her, et cetera. Her district is really an interesting district. If she were to leave, it could almost flip Republican. But more importantly, I think the way the House is configured, Nancy Pelosi does not want to get rid of too many Democrats that she can't fill with a Democrat, since, as you know, the Republicans, we didn't have a blue wave, and they picked up around 11 Republican women. So I do not think it would be Katie Porter. I would not be surprised to see Richard Cordray back. Thank you.
Interesting. Now, there's an interesting thought. Thank you, Joe. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think that Phil hit it right on the head. It was the very first thing he mentioned, which was fair lending. I think that given the administration, given Kamala Harris's position in there and some of things that she's been focusing on, at least as she was running along with Biden for the vice presidency, she talked a lot about fair lending, and so did some of her followers. So I think that is going to be key. I think it's really interesting that just last month, the end of last month, the disparate impact rule went into effect and then was stayed based upon an action in Massachusetts. I think that we might see a rewrite of that rule to try to address some of the issues raised in that litigation by the consumer advocacy groups. And it would be really interesting to apply or have applied disparate impact analysis to the use of AI.
Very interesting, Trip. Thank you. Any final thoughts before we move on?
Well, I'll just comment quickly. I agree with Phil. I don't think, though, we'll get quite the fire eaters in the Bureau, in part because whoever the new director is going to have to be approved through a Republican Senate, unless we have a long series of acting directors that we've had recently. But I think it'd be great if Richard Cordray could get the job, because I think he's tired of cutting my grass.
So you notice, Brian, it's like Brutus, you were an honorable man, of course, but you are an honorable man. So everybody got in there and said, I agree with what Phil said, except for this, and except for that. Okay.
Oh, and it only gets worse from here, I'm afraid, Phil. Let's come back to you now, Phil, and get a little more specific. And, 2020 is almost becoming a dirty word at this point, but what did we learn about our industry in the strangest of years, and what do you think what are we looking for to carry over into 2021?
Well, I think our industry, and I mean the entire settlement service industry, showed their resilience and their innovation, I think, during this pandemic, because here we were, low interest rates, low supply, great demand. This was a time for the industry to make a banner year. And yet they had a lot of roadblocks to get there, and yet they worked around them. On the mortgage side, appraisers didn't want to go into houses where there was potential coronavirus, and the sellers didn't want the appraisers in there. And the industry was able to get the GSEs and the agencies to agree to have drive-bys and other forms of evaluation than on-site reviews, and that worked out well. And on the title side, same thing. Buyers and sellers didn't want to go to offices and have closing agents close loans, and they didn't want the closing agents to go to their homes. And so Ron was reinvigorated, and that got us through this. And same thing with the the recording offices were much more liberal to allow these things to happen technologically that would have probably taken years to accomplish. They accomplished them in months. So I think resilience and innovation would mark 2020 and 2021.
Well, I'm proud of our industry, all of ALTA and all of the title insurance companies that lobbied so hard to get the town clerks, the town halls, the county records to remain open or to open. And I was receiving calls at all hours of the day, night, from agents frantic that they had to serve their customers, and they were serious. And I've heard the story, and Kevin, you may know more about it, and I don't know whose agent it is, so it's not a plug for Fidelity. But there was a fellow that bought a drive-through bank and was going to use it as his law office in Texas, I believe, and he didn't really know what he was going to do with the drive-through part. This was, I believe, right about this time last year that he bought as he was expanding his law office. And he used the drive-through, for the notarization, and rather rudimentary, but it got the job done. And Kevin, I don't know if that rings a bell with you, but our agents did so much. And I was on the phone nonstop probably in March and April. I won't list the litany of agents that wanted to know about certain counties. And if it wasn't for the ALTA list and for Fidelity's own resources,
I don't think being on the phone with a bookie counts for being on the phone, Joe. We're talking about business calls.
And then it reminds me of the quote that in Washington, the circuses closed down and all the clowns went to DC. And I guess I'll leave it with, as to what's coming up. It will still be a Washington where northern hospitality meets southern efficiency. I don't see much changing there, and I'll pass it back to you, Brian.
And Joe, Thanksgiving's coming up, so we in DC are going to have a lot of turkeys here also.
Oh, there we go. Any other thoughts, folks? What did 2020 reveal about our industry? What did it teach us, and what's carrying over into next year?
Brian, I'd love to share a little bit of what Joe said. Agree with you 100%, Joe. The title agents, and I'm talking one or two people to people that did hundreds of deals a month. They retooled. People sent people home with iPads and computers. They paid for people to have better internet. Deals got closed in spite of what was going on. People set up offices outside their office. People in Northeast Ohio and Pennsylvania had tents outside of their office that were cleaned after every consumer went there.
Those are called vacation homes in Ohio.
No, but you know, there are a lot of people that complain about the title business, the mortgage business, low-hanging fruit, easy money to be made. I think that title people, realtors, and lenders created a market over the last 8 months that really fueled our economy. And we should be patted on the back, our agents and the people who did this closing records amount of transactions. So it's a good thing. With no joke at Phil on that.
And I agree completely with all that's been said. As I've said, and many of you have heard me say, who would have believed when this year started that Sonic Drive-In would be the business model for the title and settlement industry? And I think, you know, the big question is, when we come out of COVID, how many of these improvements remain, and where do we fall back? You know, as Phil alluded to, you know, the title and settlement industry's feet are firmly planted in the 18th century. You know, how much of it do we fall back to as versus some of the improvements that have come together? And that just remains to be seen as to timing. And again, there's a great deal of money right now in the real estate industry generally. And how will that money get thrown into maintaining and improving some of those technological changes that we've used to adapt to these problems?
I heard somebody say smarter than me that it's great to have this technology, and this technology got us through the pandemic, But doing things faster doesn't necessarily mean doing them better. That technology has got to improve the process and improve the people who are using your services. And I think that this industry will do that looking forward in 2021 and beyond. But faster is not necessarily better. It's, as I said, it's got to be improving what we already built on.
I think it's a Mitch Piper quote. Isn't that a Mitch Piper quote?
Listen, Marx, I want to tell you something. You had too much gumbo today. I think some of it's on your shirt.
Phil, I'm going to ask you this. Did you always want to be an attorney? What drove you to a life of RESPA and consumer finance?
Well, I will say this, and this is truth. I have always wanted to be an attorney. I think I was 9 or 10 years old, and Perry Mason was the first legal drama on television. I watched that. He had Della Street, his assistant. He had Paul Drake, who was his personal private detective. And every week, people would confess to murders that his clients didn't commit. And that seemed to me to be a good job. And when I found out that it was mostly indoor work and no heavy lifting, I was almost sold on it. But this was the killer. This was the deal sealer for me. When I found out that there was no math or science required, I said, I'm a lawyer. And I intended to be a lawyer when I was in grade school, through high school, through college. I always envisioned that I would practice law. I have an opinion on everything. And when I found out also that you can be paid for your opinion, that's pretty darn good, because I would probably give it out for nothing. For example, Tripp said that my haircut and mustache are 1970s. Look at that V-neck sweater he has on. I had that same sweater in high school. So I would love to have that. It'll go with my haircut. I went to HUD and I worked in the legal honors program there. They picked 10 graduates from around the country. And I worked initially doing prosecuting land fraud cases and handling debarment trials. Never did any RESPA enforcement, because there wasn't any RESPA enforcement when I was at HUD. The only RESPA rulings there were informal advisory opinions and regulatory matters, but no enforcement. And then I went to practice in late 1986 or so. And around 1990, the first 2 RESPA enforcement cases ever occurred, one in the title industry, one in the mortgage industry. And because I was doing defense work at HUD representing lenders in Mortgagee Review Board license revocations and defending debarment actions and so forth, I got the first 2 RESPA enforcement cases in the country. And of course, one of them, we got the company off. It was a title company. Last time I ever got a title company off. And the other was a mortgage company. And of course, the minute that happened, I got together with Larry Platt. We wrote a book called The Practical Guide to the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act. I was giving speeches all over the country telling people about my broad experience on the enforcement side. Nobody could touch the number of cases that I'd handled. And lo and behold, I became a RESPA lawyer. And you remember on Saturday Night Live, Joe, you'll remember this, Joe Drum. They had Garrett Morris would come on playing this Cuban from on the New York Mets saying, baseball been very, very good.
Very good to me.
RESPA been very, very good to me. And I'll
Very,
say,
very
I'll say why, and that is this. Look, if you specialize in truth in lending, or the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, or ECOA, or the Fair Credit Reporting Act, your clients are lenders and bankers and mortgage brokers. That's it. But when you specialize in the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, you cover the entire gamut of the settlement service industry. And I have been honored and privileged really to represent the largest builders in the United States, the largest title companies, the largest banks, the largest vendor management companies, the largest appraisers in the country. So all of that would not have been possible if I had just focused narrowly on the lending industry. So a lot of luck involved But as I said, RESPA have been very, very good to me.
Thank you.
I'm gonna bounce up, but I just wanted to acknowledge what Phil said. Since I work currently at the National Association of Realtors, and we've been fortunate to have Phil at many of our annual meetings and education sessions when Ken ran the program. So I want to thank him for that. And we paid him a lot of money, right, Phil? But I also want to do one thing. I want to channel a colleague of mine and Ken's, who's no longer with us, a guy named Scott Wren, who I hired. He was a real estate attorney in Minneapolis. I had a job opening for RESPA policy. He had a very nice personality, and he used to teach. I said, you're hired, you can do RESPA because it's a very tedious thing. You have to have the patience of a saint. And Phil and Scott used to run our little education sessions, and it was almost like a straight man, and that was Scott, and then you had Phil. So Phil, Scott Wren sends you his best. I'm sorry, and I guess we'll see you up in the Catskills, because what the hell else are you going to do with that cadre of jokes? All right?
Absolutely. First of all,
I hope your friend Andrew Cuomo is in the audience, so you can tell him directly a lot of your jokes, and he can come back to you and tell you a lot of jokes himself. So I wish you well, and I'll see you at Costco soon, and I'll buy you a hot dog.
Okay. Before you go, Joe, though, many thanks to you, because he is one of the giants in our industry. He was up on the Hill, at HUD, at the NAR, and he had his ear to the carpet tile, as we say in Washington, and I often relied on Joe for a lot of advice and counsel, and he's been very good to me throughout my career. So unlike the other rogues that are up here, I really appreciate the fact that you were here for this.
Thanks, Phil. And you help me and you help my members. Thank you very much, and Godspeed.
Joe Ventrone, thank you for joining us today. Well, let's take.
Well, I'm sure Phil wants to get back to talking about interstate land sales.
Well, I cut my teeth prosecuting guys who were selling oceanfront views of property in Arizona. So that was a good time for me, actually.
Phil was literally the guy that was protecting the entire public from being sold the Brooklyn Bridge. That was literally his job.
Well, Phil, let's talk about talks.
First of all, let me thank Brian. And this is what was really great is this was the first time I've heard Brian say something without prefacing with, I went to Harvard Law School. So, actually, I checked. My daughter went to Harvard Law School, and I had her check. There's no Brian Levy who's ever graduated.
No, he just went there. He didn't graduate. He went to Harvard Law School.
I went there.
Well, this is probably a pretty good segue into our next question for Phil. And Phil, let's talk. A big part of your reputation through the years has been as a keynote speaker who somehow manages to make regulation compliance, Latin funny. You're one of the funniest guys in the industry. You're one of the most dynamic speakers. I have to know, do you write your own jokes? What's the challenge to that?
Well, I will say this, first of all. I have been telling jokes longer than wanting to be a lawyer when I was 9 or 10 years old. From being 7 or 8 years old, I was telling jokes. And I've always been fascinated with the art of joke telling. The elements of a joke with the setup and the anticipation and the punchline and the transitions. All of that has always fascinated me. And I have used a lot of that in my practice, and not facetiously, to say that there's a lot of stress in law, especially in enforcement, when you're dealing with people's lives and their livelihood. And being in a tense meeting or a tense situation or a tense negotiation and having a joke or a funny line, it deflates some of that stress and accomplishes a whole lot. One of the other reasons that I started, and for 45 years, every single presentation I've ever done, I've started with a joke. And I did it in part for two reasons. One, if I was nervous, telling a joke calmed me down, and the audience loves to laugh. And so if you can make people laugh, they'll love you. And it worked for me. But the other reason I did it was when we had guys on this industry and on this podcast, like a Brian Levy and a Trip Riley and a Mark Sterbcow and a Jay Barron and all the talented people who are in our industry and private practice trying to make a living, I was trying to distinguish myself from that group. And the way I did that was to at least start out every presentation with a story, and people got to know that. And I've always been amused when people come up to me and they say, listen, this is my favorite story that you tell. And it's almost never the same story or the same joke. So everybody has a different one that they love, and I love that about it. Let me tell you the dilemma of telling jokes, however. And I've told this to the folks on the podcast, but for those who don't know, 45 years, 25 presentations or more a year, you do the multiplication, it's hundreds and hundreds of jokes. And it's difficult because there are thousands of jokes that are funny, but they offend. And there are thousands of jokes that don't offend, but they're not funny. And so the challenge is to find a joke that's funny that doesn't offend. And usually you do that by making it a self-effacing joke about yourself. Then you're not offending anybody, and people like that. And I would say to clients, if you can give me a joke that I use in a speech, I'll give you a discount off of your bill. And I did that on occasion because I was so desperate to find new material. But as Joe Drum would say, Phil, as best I can tell, you told the same 3 jokes for 45 years. But I would tell a joke and someone would come up to me and say, hey, you told that 2 years ago. And I'm thinking to myself, hey, this is not a lounge at Vegas. We're here to talk about RESPA or FHA enforcement. But what I started doing was on the PowerPoints, I would write down the opening joke that I did to make sure that I didn't repeat myself. Anyway, of all the groups, though, that I've spoken to, my most enjoyable is RESPRO. And the reason is that RESPRO is a small trade association of a couple hundred members. They all come to the meetings twice a year. Everyone knows each other. I do 2 or 3 presentations every year. And so I'm allowed in RESPRO to push the envelope, to tell stories that I would never tell in any other forum. And it got to the point that these people appreciate dirt and filth. So I've enjoyed speaking with the RESPRO group. But anyway, in terms of writing jokes, yes, I write some myself, but I always will take a joke and try to flip it to circumstances that I can relate to make it sound like I'm the butt of the joke rather than the intended one that will probably offend somebody. So it's been my trademark and my signature, and we'll get a chance in a minute or at the end if I get to promote what I want to do in the future. I do want to do something with joke telling.
Well, we are definitely going to give you an opportunity to do that, Phil. But right now, I wonder if you have any particular instances or stories from your years of presentations that you might want to share right now.
Well, it's only a 90-minute presentation, so I can't do all of that. But I will say this. The best moments I've ever had were unscripted, unscheduled, unanticipated. And I will share a couple of the stories with you. Some of you guys are my buddies, and we've talked about these many times, but maybe some others have not heard them. This is a true story. Anyone who speaks knows there are 2 really bad time slots to get on a conference. One, speaking right after lunch, because people have eaten a big lunch, they're digesting it, and they almost always fall asleep. So after lunch is a bad gig. And then being the last speaker on a 3-day conference when there are only 12 people there and half of them get up with their suitcases and leave within the first 5 minutes. So I would consider that the worst. But right after lunch, very difficult. So I have a right after lunch gig, about 200 people, and I'm speaking. and a guy is asleep in the first row. Now, this has happened to me many times before, and I'm sure all of us, it's happened to. So I don't mind that. I keep going, and I'm kind of glad that he's in the first row because while a few people around him can see him, most of the people in the back cannot. But he starts snoring. And now there's no denying that he's asleep, and everybody knows it. And so I lean over the podium, and I said to this woman, "Excuse me, would you mind waking him?" And she looked up at me, and she said, "Hey, you put him to sleep. You wake him." I thought that was absolutely hilarious. Another time, and I've told this story, but I was in Denver. I'm doing a 90-minute presentation. You can't talk to anybody for 90 minutes. Nobody has that kind of attention span. And people from the title industry, maybe a few minutes at most. So I try to pepper it with jokes, but I also try to get a dialogue going with the audience so that we're talking back and forth, and it makes it a little bit more interesting. And for sure, we're going to cover the stuff they want to cover. So in order to encourage people, I would say to them, look, ask me a question and I'll answer it. Don't save your question till the end, 90 minutes from now. And to sweeten the pot, if you can ask me a question that I don't know the answer to regarding the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, I'll give you an hour of free legal services, which from a Washington, D.C. attorney is about the same price as a Toyota Camry. And I'm talking the luxury model with the heated steering wheel and the navigation system. So I start speaking in Denver, and sure enough, within 2 minutes, a guy in the back of the room raises his hand. And I'm thinking this is great because now we get a dialogue going. So I said, "Sir, question." Honest. He stands up. He said, "Mr. Schulman, let me ask you something. Why would I want an hour of free legal services from a guy who doesn't know the answer to my question?" And the place erupts. And I thought that was very funny. And I said, I don't know why. I'm going to give you the hour. And in front of 600 people, he said, "Don't want it." And it was hilarious. A story that maybe I want to share this story about the time I mistakenly, with good judgment, I thought, asked him to advance my slides on a Sunday afternoon. And he can tell that story at a later date. But I do want to tell you two stories before I pass this on. One, I don't know if Chuck Cain remembers. Chuck invited me to Kalamazoo, Michigan to speak at Western Michigan University, giving a RESPA presentation. I think he was at lawyer's title at the time. And as I look around to Vaso and Drum and Cain, these are people who cannot hold a job. I mean, months they're working where they used to work 7 years ago because the people who are working there now don't remember them from when they worked there 7 years ago. So he was with lawyer's title before it was with Fidelity. So he invites me to Kalamazoo, Michigan. I give this presentation in the auditorium at the university. Holds about 3,000 people, this auditorium. We have about 100 people there. There are 3 people, third row center, and everybody else, the other 95 people, whatever, are in the back of this auditorium underneath the mezzanine. I can't even see them. And I keep asking them, "Come on up. I'm not going to bite you. I won't call on you." And they don't move. I said, "Why can't you be like these 3 people in the front row?" And the guy looked up in the front row and said, "This isn't Les Mis?" I got off the stage. I had a lavalier mic on. I had to walk back underneath the mezzanine, and I did the presentation underneath the mezzanine to the 95 or 100 people. And I never did another thing for Chuck Cain. I'm going to end with this story, which is my favorite story of all time speaking. Woman named Edna from San Juan, Puerto Rico, in the mortgage business. I think she had the largest mortgage banking business in San Juan. And I would see her at the MBA legal issues conferences and the national conferences and so forth. And she said to me, "Phil, you must come to San Juan and speak to us at the Mortgage Bankers Association. I said, Edna, I don't speak Spanish. I couldn't. Oh, Phil, please, everyone speaks English. You'll come. So I said, okay. And I get down there, and the whole time I'm saying, Edna, people speak English, right? I'm not going to have it. Oh, Phil, please stop it. So I get there. I'm like the third speaker that morning. The governor of the island kicks off this conference, maybe 300 Puerto Rican mortgage bankers. It's all in Spanish. But I'm not worried because he's the governor. Then the director of the mortgage banking department for the island gets up and he does some opening remarks. It's all in Spanish. But again, I'm not worried because he's the director. The first speaker gets up, an attorney, and it's all in Spanish. And now I'm worried because I'm not. And I really don't speak Spanish. I get up there and Edna introduces me in Spanish. I lean over to her and I said, Edna, you said people speak English. And she looked at me and said, oh, Phil, please, this is Puerto Rico. Everyone speaks Spanish. So they had an interpreter. Everybody had headsets on. And for 90 minutes, I do this presentation with a lag. There's a translator in the booth. Of course, 90 minutes, I'm doing jokes with a lag, but it seems to be going okay. But I noticed one guy not laughing, sitting halfway up the aisle on the end. So I want to have a good time. I get off of the stage and I walk up to this guy. And I said to the woman in the booth, the translator, I said, could you come out of the booth for a minute? I said, look, I'm giving this presentation. I've done 5 or 6 jokes. This guy has not even cracked a smile. Would you ask him if it's my jokes or your translation that is killing it for him? And she gets out to his mouth, and he says, I don't know what's going on, but I turned to her, truth. I said to her, what did he say? And she says, in front of about 300 people, he says, you're not that funny. The place went crazy. And that was just a good time. Last story, and just to tell you that once in a while I do hit. I have told thousands of jokes at presentations. And if you ask me, what is the joke that got the loudest roar, the most successful joke you've ever told in the history of 45 years of telling jokes? I'm looking at Kevin Breeland, not because he is a joke, but he is a joke, but because he's in Austin. And it was in Austin, Texas. I gave a speech there for the homeowners Title I group. And I started with this joke. I said, I was in a bar last night in Austin. A guy about 5'4" comes in wearing a University of Texas sweatshirt. And in a loud voice, he says, hey, you want to hear a joke about those dumb Aggie football players? And with that, a guy about 6'8", 280, picks this little guy up literally by his neck. And he says, I have to be the starting defensive tackle for the Texas A&M Aggies. And you see that guy down the end of the bar and he whips his neck. 6'4", 240. He's our starting tight end. And you see the guy next to him and he whips his neck again. 6'8", 320 pounds. He's our starting nose guard. You still feel like telling that joke? And the little guy said, not now. Not if I might have to explain it 3 times. Place went crazy. I got a standing ovation. Ovation. Fabulous. And now I will say one other thing and I'm done. I don't know if it was Chuck Cain or it was Joe Drum. I gave a speech somewhere. It was during the Olympics. And I got up and, of course, I did the opening joke. And it was Joe Drum. Joe had a group of folks sitting 3rd row center, all with placards. And after I delivered the joke, they stood up and gave me a 7, a 4. The East German judge gave me a 0, but the British judge gave me a 6. And all of the folks turned around and gave me I ended up with, I think, a 7.1, which wasn't bad for an opening joke, but that was something Joe did to me and it was very funny.
I will. I got one. So, well, my career has spanned 41 years. It really came to a professional peak about, I think it's 10, 11 years ago. Phil and I, along with Jay and Sue and Ray, were doing the Travel and Respro Fall Conference, and we were in LA, and we had a conference that we did there, and then we all flew up to Chicago and did a conference there. And so all of you who know Phil, who's had the opportunity to travel with Phil, you've also had the opportunity to see how impatient of a traveler Phil is and how much he wants the plane to take off when he arrives. Doesn't really matter if anyone else is going. He's ready, and he's ready to go. And then, as soon as he gets off the plane, taxis need to be waiting. Luggage should, he doesn't check in anything. He carries it all on. He works excessively on the flight, so he doesn't have to talk to anybody, and he just keeps on going. Well, ours started off with, we have a really good day in LA. I thought it was a great conference. We get outside, the driver is about 10 minutes late, and Phil and Jay are just about in total meltdown by this point because we're downtown and we got to go out to LAX, and it is 5 o'clock in the evening. So the driver shows up, he takes some sort of tollway all the way out to the airport, and we're there in 40 minutes, no time at all, only to find out that our flight is delayed till 8:30. And then delayed till 10:30. So this is not settling well with my travel mates. Me, I don't care. I don't have anything to do. But apparently Phil and Jay were double parked someplace because they needed to get to Chicago. But yeah, finally take off about 11. We are the only 5 people on the flight from LA to Chicago on Southwest Airlines. So it's the only time you'll ever get first class service on Southwest, because there's only 5 people on there. And Jay and Phil, to their credit, they work the entire time on the flight. Get to the airport, man, they are zooming to a taxi because, I don't know, I guess the coin-operated bed was out of coins or whatever, but they needed to get out of there in a hurry. There were no taxis. They ended up having to ride with us, and of course, they had to be dropped off first. So that was my experience traveling with Phil. It was a great experience, but enough of my career. What about everybody else's?
Well, first of all, Kevin, how great that you are on a work release program from prison and could be with us today. I was worried sick. And I don't know if your life peaked 11 years ago when you were the president of Respro. To me, I think it peaked in high school, to be honest with you. But that is a true story. Jay and I did this roaming training for Respro every year, and we would go to LA and Chicago and Atlanta and all over the country. And one year, I don't know if it was that tour, Kevin, we went to the offices of Foley Lardner in, I think it might have been LA or might have been another city, and nothing worked. The screen.
That was LA.
The screen didn't work for the PowerPoint. The electricity wasn't on in the building. The microphones didn't work. And the whole time, it was the greatest for me because I said, at K&L Gates, we have great electricity. Our clients rave about our electricity. So that was a lot of fun. But I do remember that. And you also remember Sue Johnson, when she would come into the room and there was 2 minutes to go, she'd go. Then when there was a minute to go, and then when you were out of time, and if you didn't shut up, she actually had a BB gun. So I usually try to finish on time with Sue. Very intense woman. I got to turn to Joe Drum for a minute. And because Joe and Chuck, as an industry, we're not that funny. But these 2 guys, honestly, I would say, and Basso too, these 3 guys really know how to tell a joke. And they have hundreds of jokes. And I've stolen hundreds of jokes from the 3 of them. But I want to tell you 2 quick Joe Drum stories. Tormented me. And Joe, I'll tell you something. I love him like a brother. He helped my career so much. He thinks I don't appreciate it, but I do. He got me so many openings. I did work for over 35 title companies, all companies that Joe worked for about 15 minutes.
Hey, I didn't work for them. I was employed by them.
Right. A very funny. Here's two things that this guy did to me. He calls me up on a Friday afternoon once and he says, "Did you sleep with my secretary?" I said, "Are you crazy?" He said, No, I'm serious. "Did you sleep with my secretary?" I said, "Joe, of course not." He said, "Well, good. Then you can fire her."
Brian, please edit that out.
I'm trying to figure out how to block him completely, but he's disabled his mute button.
But this is something he did to me, which I will never forget.
Mr. Denninger from the repair company?
Yeah. So, here's the thing about these guys in sales, like Vaso and Cain and Drum. They know if you want to get through to somebody, make friends with their secretary. And then have a dialogue, make sure they know who you are, they take the calls and all the rest. So I would say to my secretary, look, next 2 hours, anybody calls, I'm not here, don't let them through. And Joe would call or Vaso would call and my secretary said, yeah, Phil says to tell everybody he's not here, but he's in the office. Let me get him. Phil, it's John Vaso, So they're very good with knowing my secretary. So my secretary's on vacation. I have a temp. Joe calls and it's not Veronica. So he knows it's not my regular secretary. I'm at lunch. I come back. This was years ago. And you remember when they had the pink telephone messages?
While you were out.
Yeah. One would be pink and one would be yellow. And the secretary would keep the yellow one and she put the pink ones on your desk. This woman comes in holding this pink telephone message like it is toxic, like it's radioactive. And she's looking at me in a way that makes me feel like I'm despicable. I have no idea what's going on, but she goes, here. And she drops this thing on my desk. It's from Mr. Dennard from the Man-Boy Association. Please be advised that your dues check bounced again. And unless you wire us $73, we will have to cancel your subscription to Man-Boy magazine. And of course, I see it's area code 617. I know it's Drum, but that was it. I'm serious. I had to get another temp because she would not work with me the next day.
Joe, should I edit that part out too?
How many jokes?
Probably be a lot of editing on this. It might be a 30-minute clip.
So I wanted to tell a story. I'm a slight bit younger than the rest of you. But I met Phil almost early, mid-90s when I started to go to Respro. I met Chuck, I met Joe, and all of these guys have been tremendous for my career, and they're wonderful friends, really supportive. But it's another thing for Phil when you're on the stage and one of your other co-presenters is attempting to belittle you in front of, I don't know, this was like, there must have been 400 or 500 people during this session, because it was Phil, because everyone was there to see him, and no one was there to see me, and a couple other people on the panel they were also there to see. And one of the panel members, I spoke. He had already spoken. I spoke, and then he interjected, basically saying I didn't know what I was talking about. And so let me tell you, audience, what Riley is really trying to say. Now, to Phil, I would tell Phil saw a perfect way to make a joke out of it, because that's what he does. But he really stood up for me in a way that was both professional as well as digging at the person who did this to me. And I will never forget that, because it was just tremendous. It was a tremendous feeling to have Phil stand up for you, in front of all of these people. And so I've never forgot that. I want to thank Phil for that. And I think from that point on, we've been at least intended to be a good friend.
I will say this. First of all, do not confuse young with immature. You're immature. You're not young. There's a difference there.
Yeah.
No, I remember the incident. This guy, full of himself, gets up and speaks. We're all supposed to have 15 minutes. He takes about 25. Tripp is the second speaker. He does his thing, and the first speaker butts in the middle and says, well, what Tripp really meant, and he goes into this thing. So then it was my turn, and I said, well, no need for me to speak. And I turned to the first speaker, and I said, you probably know what I'm going to say, so why don't you deliver my presentation? And that
Well, a story I'd like to tell about Phil really isn't about professional per se. I mean, I think the first time we met was in the basement of one of those Pittsburgh law firms you were always a member of because you had to go out of town to get a job. When Respro was meeting in the basement of an office that you had provided. So we go back a long way, but Phil's younger daughter, Tammy, and my older son, Kerry, both went to Washington University in St. Louis, and they started the same year. And I remember Phil and I were talking, and Phil, in the conversation, clearly showed to me using a spreadsheet how he and I were basically responsible for 50% of the budget of the Washington University year, and they expected us to make timely payments. But I was saying to him, I said, well, and we had connected the two kids at that point in time, so they could meet their incoming freshmen. And I said, well, Phil, I said, maybe they'll get to meet, and maybe they'll hit it off, and who knows, maybe they'll start to date. And with that, he cuts me off and he says, wait a minute right there, Cain. Said, there is no way in hell you will ever be my brother-in-law. Then he goes on to make a couple of comments about trying to see if there might be Jewish convents to send Tammy to if it got to be that point. That sort of moment, and we always commiserated about how many wings at WashU they should have named the Schulman Cain wing for our dollars being paid. But I will say too that there are certain stories that particularly several of us on this know to be among Phil's favorite stories. A large number of those are not for PG audiences, and I just have to say,
they're
Phil,
not
that
for sailors.
No, and I'll just say that though numerous times when checking into a hotel, I have asked the guy at the front desk whether their porn channel was disabled, and I've never gotten the same response that you have always provided. So that being said, but it's. A great man, and there was an old story about Phil that I think it's apocryphal, but that allegedly when he graduated from Northeast Law School, and this shows what a religious man he is. When he graduated from Northeast Law School, he and a law school colleague, who also happened to be Jewish, decided to rent a sailboat in the Pacific. And they sailed around, but as misfortune hit them, the storm blew them ashore. They were stuck on an island. The boat was damaged. And it was a couple of weeks before a ship came by to rescue them. And when the ship's captain landed, he noticed they had built 3 huts on the beach. And the captain said, well, those are really good huts to provide shelter to you. And Phil said, oh, no, those aren't huts. So those are synagogues. He said, synagogues? He said, you got 3 synagogues. He said, yeah. He said, the one behind me here, that's my synagogue. And the second one, that's my friend's synagogue. And the captain says, so what's the third one? And Phil says, oh, nobody ever goes to that synagogue. So, he's a very religious man. But there's an awful lot of sides to Phil that until you get to know him and what a fine man he is, and I mean this genuinely, it's reflected in Tripp's story as well. It's not just this skimming the surface where he knows a lot about RESPA and is a great speaker. A fine man, and it's been a great pleasure to know you. But I think that, and again, if this sounds like an obituary, I'm just trying to save a future plane trip. But I think that Probably, say, knowing Phil, this will be the first of many retirements, almost as many as Sinatra's. So we look forward to you not going away.
I thank you for that, and I'm not dying. I will say this because Chuck and I both had kids who went to WashU University, and this was back in 2000 whatever 6, 7.
Yeah.
It was like buying a Lexus 460, dousing it in kerosene, setting it on fire, and rolling it off a cliff every September 4 times. It's incredible how much that school costs. So my daughter starts applying to law school, and she calls me that she got into Penn. Now, Penn Law School is one of the top 5 law schools in the country, and she tells me she got a scholarship. And I am head over heels. Can you imagine? My wife and I are going to be able to eat 3 meals now. And I said, Tammy, I am so proud of you. That is terrific. Congratulations. What a feather in your cap. About 2 weeks later, she calls me, Dad, I got into Harvard. It's been my lifelong dream to go to Harvard. And I said, Tammy, it's been my lifelong dream to have you go to Penn. Since 2 weeks ago. So I'm going to Harvard and her old man footed the bill, but nevertheless. Our 2 people I know have got to tell 2 stories that I know are fantastic. Ken, will you tell the story about when I asked you to advance the slides for me on a Sunday afternoon?
Sure. And in fact, this really touches on a number of things that we talked about here, because this was November 7th, 2010, a Sunday. If anybody who's ever been to an NAR conference, they know it's like a week long, and this is the very end of the NAR conference. So like the ultimate closing session on the last day of the last day of the last day. And I was not even supposed to be at this session. The aforementioned colleague Scott Wren had planned this, and Scott took ill. And so I said, all right, I'll fill in, I'll advance the slides for Phil. And then I noticed at the very same time that Phil was doing his presentation, and many of you know this, that I am a diehard but not yet dead New York Jets fan. The New York Jets were playing the Detroit Lions. And ironically, and because a Jet fan can remember this very well, the Jets were good that season, because that's how few seasons they are good, that we remember when they're really good. And so this was the early days. We still had Blackberries and everything. And I had my little Blackberry there, and Phil starts doing his presentation, and I am checking the score on the Jet game. And it takes forever to load, and the Jets are losing 20-10. And all of a sudden, Phil goes, hey, what happened, Ken? Advance the slide, on to the next slide. I'm like, oh, okay. I advanced the slide. And the Jets are still losing 20-10. It's the 4th quarter, and I'm like shaking the BlackBerry to make it, reload the page again. And, they're still losing. And Phil goes, Ken, are you screwing with me? Because Phil knew that I knew this rest of stuff. I should be able to pay attention to it. So and he's like, are you screwing with me? He said, no, because I said, Phil, I'll tell you about it later. And so we get through the presentation, and he's like, what the hell's going on? I said, the Jets are like coming back. They're having this great comeback against the Detroit Lions. And I was trying to check the score here to see if they were going to win. He's like, all right, so we rush out of there without taking, and this is goes to the final point about Phil's character. Instead of berating me, he said, let's go find a bar and see if we can watch the rest of this game. And so that's what we did. The Jets wound up winning 23-20, and but I was forbidden from ever doing slide duty again, and it became sort of the running joke.
Well, I wouldn't tell the story exactly like that. There was a time where I couldn't speak and advance slides at the same time. And so usually somebody at the event would advance the slides. Scott couldn't make it. I asked Ken to do it. he's got earbuds on, but he's advancing my slides, but he's advancing them. And I'm, Ken, the next slide. Yeah, sorry. And he advances it. And then I said, Ken, next slide. He goes, yes. And I go, wow, I didn't expect that kind of reaction. And then I asked him to advance it again. And I go, son of a bitch, in the red zone? I said, what are you doing? He said, oh, I'm listening to the Jets game. So that was like the last time that he ever advanced slides for me. So do you remember the first time we met and you invited me to give a speech in Ohio?
I do. 93. But we had plans to go to dinner with about 8 of our people, all First American people at the time. We pick him up at the hotel. You might have come in from the airport actually to where we were. And he said, I'll eat anything but Japanese food. Euro Chow was the name of the restaurant. He's the only one that didn't order sushi. He didn't order anything tempura fried. He ordered a ribeye steak. We ate appetizers, salad, soup, sushi, meals, and his steak came out about 15 minutes after all of us had finished eating. And in spite of that, we have stayed friends for 27 years and spent a lot of time together. The one thing I would like to share is many of you know Dan Wald, Old Republic General Counsel, and some of you know Robert Wasserman, who just retired from Old Republic. And I've got a neighbor named Timmy Kadelka. And this is sort of a joke group. Timmy would tell me a joke on the weekend, and I would call all 3 of these guys. And Phil was in on that group. So anytime I got a good joke, I might call Phil. I could be in the middle of something, and Phil would call me. And I would tell people, hey, you got to hold on. This guy's a big-time DC attorney. I got to take his call. And I'd walk out of the room, and he goes, I got a joke for you. So it was always great having good material and have somebody sending it to you, or hearing a great joke and going, Phil, I got a joke for you. You just can never tell it in front of an audience. You might be able to tell it to these 10 people here, but you could never tell it. And Robert Wasserman would always call those jokes the jokes he could tell the last day of his career. So.
Absolutely. He did pick me up. He says, what kind of food you like? I said, I'll eat anything but sushi. And he said, we're going to a sushi restaurant. And the reason I waited 15 minutes for the steak is because they didn't have steak. They had to go out and get a steak and make it for me. It was horrible. You've got to have a story.
What?
I say, is there any story with us?
Yeah.
Phil,
And in conclusion,
Phil, I could say to you, Phil, the number 56, and you would know that that's a punchline to a joke. I could say to you, but you can ask me the 2 questions. What do I do for a living? And to what do I attribute my success? Do you remember that?
I do. What do you do for a living, Joe?
I'm a comedian.
And what do you attribute?
Timing. Phil, that's probably been the quintessential parenthetical description of our relationship. Is that when he'd be coming down an escalator and I'd be going up in some hotel somewhere, and he would tell me the punchline of a joke. Then I'd switch and I'd turn around and go down and talk to him. And for about 10 or 15 minutes, we would tease each other about the jokes we were going to use, or what do you think about opening with this joke? And of course, it's a joke you couldn't open with then, let alone now in the woke environment. But Phil and I would spend, I don't know, Phil, 10, 15, 20 minutes on jokes that we could, again, would be the last day of our employment. I was very disappointed to hear that he likes steak, because after we watched the Red Sox beat the California Angels in the 10th inning in Boston in 2004, Phil, I don't know if you remember this, we ran from Fenway Park because I had set up a meeting. It was an ALTA convention in Boston, and also happened to be the playoffs. You remember this?
I do remember it.
And I had set up where, yes, actually, I find it somewhat cruelly ironic that he talks about how many times Chuck and I have changed companies. When I started to think, I wrote down a list of law firms with which you've been involved, Phil, over the last 12 years. And I won't go there. But I will go to us. We were running out of Fenway. There was a dinner that had started, and they brought Phil. As we got in, I introduced him to Parker Kennedy, a First American, and Phil sat next to him, and I was on the other side, and noticed that they served Phil a steak. It was surf and turf and a lobster, and he called the waitress over. Now, I just spent, I won't go into how much I spent to get the playoff tickets for the Red Sox.
Well, you've told me 100 times. Why don't you tell everyone?
In any event, Phil sent away the steak and the lobster because they touched, and he asked for fish. And I said, "You couldn't have slipped that over to me?"
That's right. He said, "What's the matter? You couldn't give me the lobster?" I will tell you one story. Joe has been very, very good to me. When my daughter was at WashU, 2004, Red Sox were down 3-0 against the Yankees. They came back and won 4 straight and got to the World Series. And Joe had said to me,
that was the week before.
It was 2004, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was the week before that the lobster.
Yes.
Story.
But he promised, he said, if they get to the World Series, we're going. So he calls me up. He said, I've got tickets for Game 5 of the World Series in St. Louis. I'm excited because my daughter's at WashU.
And the visitors on deck circle.
I think in the locker room. I mean, again, I don't want to say they were expensive tickets, but I sold mine, and that's why I'm It's the 5th game of the World Series. I'm a diehard Red Sox fan. He's even more diehard than I am because he's from New England, or he's from Nebraska, New England. He went to school in Nebraska, but you have a New England background. And right. So we love the Red Sox. Game 5. So the Red Sox are playing the Cardinals. They win the first 2 games. Now I have a dilemma because I want them to win. They haven't won a World Series in almost 100 years, but I don't want them to lose.
They won the first 3 games.
I'm getting there, Joe. It's a joke.
Sorry. I don't mean to step on your punchlines.
Working with amateurs. Yeah.
Yep. Now, when you write the material, you just have a different expectation.
They win the first 2 games, and I'm thinking, I hate to do this, but I got to root against them. It's got to go to 5 games. Sure enough, they win the 3rd game. Now it's the 4th game, and if the Red Sox don't lose, I got a ticket to St. Louis tomorrow morning. Joe got us fancy a hotel to stay at. I'm going to the 5th game of the World Series. I'll see my daughter. The first inning, what is Damon, whatever his name, Johnny Damon.
Damon. But I'm at LAX because I cannot get to St. Louis unless I take the red eye. So I'm on the phone with Phil, and we're watching the game. And because if the Red Sox lose,
grand slam, son of a bitch, they're up like 7-0 after 1 inning, and they sweep. And so if you go to my office, I have a picture that Joe made for me of Babe Ruth, and then a picture of that ticket from the 5th game of the World Series. And it's one of my dearest possessions. But they came back in 2007 and they did the trick, but I never got to go to that game.
To hang around, do you want to tell a short
story? No, I really only have one story, which is my shining moment where Phil and I had a joke off, and I actually won, and he was gracious enough to concede. So just another reason why I admire him.
I'll just tell one Loretta story that at the NBA conference, reg compliance every year, 700-800 people. On the 3rd day, when They break at noon. Just before that, at 11:30, they invite all of the speakers back for a round table to kind of cover the events in the industry and of the last few days. And Loretta is the MC, and she walks around with a microphone and peppers the audience and the participants with questions. And she walked over when she started it and sat on my lap and did the presentation on my lap.
I was facing forward, Phil. I was facing forward. I thought it was okay.
That was probably my favorite presentation of all time. So I wanted to thank you for that. Anyway, I know we're running long on time. I haven't let Brian say a word. Let me say something. Absolutely a first-class gentleman, unlike anybody else I see on this panel. I have done as many presentations with Brian as I have with anyone, and he's just a delight. He's a guy who says, Phil, whatever, you want to go first, go first. You want to go third. Whatever you want me to speak about. I went to Harvard Law School. People know that. And I have just enjoyed immensely working with him. But Brian, I give you the floor.
Well, first of all, I have to respond to one thing that Phil said. I have not once mentioned that Phil's daughter goes to Harvard Law School.
Okay.
And actually, ironically, today we may have had a little trouble with the audio at times, and it's literally because the only person on this panel who does not have a mute button is Phil Schulman.
That is true. I could put it on mute, but I didn't want to.
He doesn't know how.
No, it is always a pleasure to work with you, Phil. I've learned so much from you over the years. Frankly, it's always been an honor to speak with you. Hopefully I get to speak first so I can actually get in a word in edgewise. But it's always terrific to work with somebody who sees things the right way when it comes to RESPA, and who knows it inside out, and then can deliver that with a sense of humor. So always a tremendous pleasure for me.
Thank you. Brian, I know you're going to give me the last word on at least telling people what I want to do in the future. So
I was just about to say that myself, Phil. So you beat me to it. This is not a eulogy, it turns out, right? We're talking about maybe some changes in your career and maybe some new things coming up. So why don't you tell us what's next for Phil Schulman?
All right. Well, first of all, I'm transitioning from a partnership at Mayer Brown to become senior counsel, which is just a fancy way of saying that my email address will go into work a few days a month and work a few hours a month. But basically, I'll be mostly retired. And we'll look forward to doing some charity work, playing golf, and do something that I've had an idea about doing for a number of years. And that is doing something with comedy. I do tell jokes, I think, as well as anybody. As I said, I've been a student of art of telling jokes my whole life. And so I put together a presentation, 1 hour presentation on how to tell a joke. And I call the session, what do you mean you can't tell a joke? You're in sales. And it's a presentation for sales reps at their 2-day meetings where they're looking for 1 hour to just kind of, relax and let their brains do something, think hard about sales. And so what I do is I debunk all of the reasons why people say they can't tell a joke. I go through the difficulties that there are in telling jokes. I go through the elements that are found in every joke, the setup, the anticipation, and the punchline. I pepper it with all kinds of jokes, and then I go through my top 10 list of do's and don'ts for good joke telling. And then I turn it over to the audience and ask them to tell jokes. And then the companies usually put up some prizes for the best jokes and the worst joke. And so I started to do this in February. I did it for a large mortgage company in Dallas the first week in February. And the third week in February, I did it for a real estate brokerage firm in Detroit. And it went well. I was worried that I wouldn't get up and tell jokes at the end, but they're in sales. They think they're funny. They're not. They're funny. And they do jokes. So what I'm going to be doing once this pandemic is over, I'm hoping that I will do something with companies, not just in our industry, but in all industries, on the art of telling a joke. And I think I've got it down. I think it'll be funny. And hopefully, if you know anybody who's looking to fill an hour, give me a holler. This is not a eulogy, but I have been blessed. I have a blessed wife, tremendous wife, 2 great kids, a great son-in-law, and a granddaughter that I'm loving every moment I get to spend with her. But I'm so grateful that this was my vocation, this was my career, and this was the industry I chose to do it with. Because people who are on this podcast, they're friends first, they're colleagues second, and competitors third. And I've never thought of them as competitors. There's plenty of business to go around. And whenever I couldn't handle a case, I would refer to the people who are on this podcast, and they would do vice versa. And we know if a client is sent to you from another law firm, you don't steal that client. You do that limited work and you send it back to them, because that's the honorable thing to do. And that's what these guys, and that's what I've done. And when I go to these conferences, the first night our law firm will sponsor some kind of cocktail party, something for everybody. The second night, I take out our big hitters. And the third night, I go out to dinner with Brian, Rip, and Marx, John, and Joe, and Chuck, and all these guys, just for fun. And that is my most favorite thing to do at all of those sessions and conventions. That's what it's all about in the end. And I am very lucky that I get to call all of you friends. And even you, Ken, seriously. I mean, that was touch and go for a second. But at the end of the day, tipped over to the friends stop, because we did watch the end of that game in a bar in the hotel, and they did win 23-20. And that made me think, if a guy likes the Jets, you got to feel for him. Anyway, Brian, Rick, Kevin, thank you for putting this together. So what? This was a nice way for me to spend an hour and a half, and I will be billing you, Brian, for this.
Please send it along. I'm not paying Marx's anyways, so we've got a little left over. On that note, Phil Schulman, it's been an incredible beginning to a new journey, I would say. When we do get the details on your next stage, we'll get them up here on the show page, and I would hope you'll come back and tell us a little more.
I'll probably have to charge you for it, but sure.
Okay, that's reasonable. We'll put you through to Rick for that. But
I've seen some of your bills, invoices, Bill, and they are a joke.
On that note, I'd like to thank all of our special guests today, and I'd especially like to thank Phil Schulman for joining us. I hope this is not the last time we see him on the show. We'll have you back anytime you want. We'll have any of you back anytime you want. But unfortunately, and I don't know if you guys know this, we record this show on a 2nd generation iPad. It's a little old, and we've actually managed to fill up the memory. So thank you all again, and Mr. Grant, take us home.